using a camera online, can you please let me know if you can see my screen? It should say PNC Training, Minnesota Valley's Presbytery. Are you all able to see that?
Yes.
Okay,
I
great.
can.
Okay. For those who are not using a camera today to see online, I'm happy to make these slides available to you. So let's begin. We do want to be conscious of your time, and I'm very thankful that you were able to join the call this afternoon. We are recording this training session, and so if you would like to share it with your search committees, you're welcome to do that. We will have it posted on the Presbytery website. Let me check our volume just to make sure that you can hear me clearly this afternoon. How's the volume for you?
Good for me.
Good for me.
Okay. Well, for those who I haven't had a chance to meet, I am your Presbytery executive and so happy to serve you today and to resource you around issues of your search process. And maybe you have some particular questions that you would like to have answered. I just wanted to let you know that during this conversation, there will be a PowerPoint presentation, but I invite your questions. We will allow some time at the end, but during the presentation, if you have a particular question for the good of the group, feel free to ask that question, because I do want this to be your time and we want to be able to answer the questions that you have. So let's begin with our conversation around searching for a pastor and some particular things that I think would be important for you as pastor nominating committee members. Let's find out who's on the call. So if you wouldn't mind just saying your name and what congregation you're from, that would be helpful for me. And your role, if you are on the search committee or that type of information would be helpful. So John, let's start with you.
Okay, I'm John Williamson, and I'm from Hope Presbyterian Church, and I'm serving on the PNC.
Thank you.
I'm Myron Fitzik. I'm also on Hope Presbyterian Church, the PNC.
Thank you. I'm glad we were able to get things set up for you, Myron.
Yep.
Are there others on the call?
I'm Barb Virginiak, and I am from Silver Lake Faith Presbyterian Church, and I am on the PNC committee.
Thank you, Barb. Is there anyone else? I see the name Haley. Is that someone else on the call? Okay. We will continue. I'm going to ask if you would just become familiar with your toolbar on your computer. So if you would like to mute, if you get a lot of background noise, right down at the bottom, you should see an option to mute. Or for my computer, it's at the top on the right, and you can actually hit mute. It may be on the bottom on the left. You just need to find that. You can use your cursor to find that mute button. If you have a question that you want to type in, you can also, there's 3 dots there. If you click on that, it will allow you to type. And you can actually type in a question. It says chat. You can select whether it's for the entire group or whether or not you would like to just send me a chat message. And hopefully I'll be able to see it and then respond. But I also, as I said earlier, invite you to ask your questions when you need to ask them. So let's get started. I'm talking about the pastor's nominating committee and some particular things that I think would be beneficial for you in your search process. I like to begin with first things. As you're thinking about searching, some of you have been in the process for a little while, and some of you are just starting in the process. The first thing that I like to say to search committees is that the biggest part of your work is discernment. So one of the things that we know is that if you are in between pastors and you're seeking a pastor, that you're definitely looking for a pastoral leader. So we understand that. But discernment is really about leadership needs. How do you come together as a search committee? How do you discern the needs of the congregation and look at where the congregation is, their vision for ministry, your past history, your present history, your resources? How will you come together as a group to know the voice of God as God is speaking to you as you consider the many people that may be applying for your position? So really having an understanding of how you will do discernment together is a very important first step in your process. The other thing is to learn the call process. So within the Presbyterian Church, we do have a particular polity around how pastors are able to call. And one of the things that is very important to keep in mind is that when a pastor is called to a congregation, the pastor is not just called to a congregation, but the pastor is also called to serve within the Presbyterian Church, to serve the presbytery if they're a teaching elder, and to serve the larger church. If they're a ruling elder, commissioned pastor, then their pastoral roles are restricted to a local congregation, but there's still the expectation that that person would serve as a minister member of the presbytery. And so it's important to learn. Our presbytery has a particular process that we recommend, and our resources around how you follow our process, you can find all of those online. And I'm sure your liaisons have worked with you around those issues. I really recommend that you use the Uncalling a Pastor resource. The Uncalling a Pastor resource is a resource that the denomination, the Presbyterian Church, PCUSA, put together several years ago. It was revised back in 2016, and so it has been updated to match any Book of Order changes, but it has a lot of step-by-step resources for search committees. And in 2016, we added tutorials. And so a part of this presentation will be actually pointing you to those resources. Let me just pause and ask, how many of you have already used the Uncalling a Pastor tutorials as a part of your pastor nominating committee training?
I've read the brochure.
You've read the brochure. Has anyone used any of the resources? Okay, so I want to encourage you that that's really a part of your first things that you want to do. I'll refer to that a little bit later. So the question of what kind of pastor, I really like this cartoon that talks about these are the shoes of our last pastor. You may want to try them on for size. Maybe we don't come out and say that, but in the back of our minds, we all remember the pastor that has served us well. And so often when we're doing the search process, we point to what was, and that's our measurement. You know, that's our standard for what the next pastor would be. Either you really like that previous pastor and you wish you could clone that person, or you have a situation where you want someone that's totally opposite for various reasons. And so the whole idea is that how do you, again, become open to the process? And sure, you've seen good ministry, we've seen not so good ministry, but you know, how do we really look at who God is calling to service at this particular point in time? And so this is a quote from an article that I wrote for the National Church, but the choice of a pastor should be guided by a congregation's vision for the future and not just its memory of the past. I think that that's very important. Most of our congregations are in transition. And what that means is that it's a new day. It's a new day. Ministry is done in very different ways than what has been done in years past. The way that people are utilizing the church is often very different. Denominational loyalty is not as important to people as it was at one time. So there are many things that change today when we think about ministry. But the particular thing that I think has not changed is the fact that God will send pastors to congregations. That has not changed. And that there is a person that's called to walk with you and to help you to continue to grow in your faith. I do believe that that is still the same. So when you're choosing leaders, there's all kind of leaders with various experiences, leaders that have a very clear vision of what their gifts for ministry is. For others, there are people who are learning. They may be in their first calls. People who are growing into their own pastoral identity. People who may even have been in ministry for a while, and now they've been in ministry long enough to know what works for them and what doesn't work. And so when you're choosing leaders, just know that people come with previous experiences, but they also come with particular gifts, unique gifts, and it's going to be important. I'm showing you this document. You can find this document also online. Now, when I pulled this document up, it was at 8:55 this morning. It's a real-time snapshot of what the denomination calls the Applicants in Positions Report. If you can see this document, it will tell you that there are 2,103 call seekers looking for positions in the Church Leadership Connection system. 1,916 of that number are currently teaching elders. Then there's 178 candidates for first calls, and they're in our system. And then there are lay professionals that wouldn't apply to the positions that you have available, but there are lay professionals, 9, who are looking for non-pastoral positions in our system. There are currently 640 positions in the system, and 133 of that 640 are positions that are open to first call pastors. When you look at the gender of the various people in the system, 896 females are looking for calls, and 1,199 males are currently looking for calls in the system. The report goes on to tell you that there are 31 racial, ethnic, multi-ethnic congregations that are in the system, and there are 311 racial, ethnic call seekers in the system. There is also a note that says open but not active. There are 708 PIFs in the system of people who may self-refer to you to be considered for a position, but they're not individuals that will be matched with you electronically. Any questions about this report?
Out of the currently the 2,103 call seekers, is that how many of them are looking as to be a pastor for the congregation? Would that be a teaching elder, or how do they determine that?
So that's a very good question. And so I'm going to show you one other report that goes along with this applicants and positions report. So on the next slide, if we were actually looking at this report online, we would actually be able to look at each state geographically and be able to see how many people are applying for positions within that state. And the majority of those positions would be pastoral positions. So what I did, because it's a pretty long report, I actually went to Minnesota. So do you see this red arrow?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yes.
the red arrow shows you that, now this is not for our particular presbytery, it's for our particular state. There are 2 positions within Minnesota. There are 3 presbyteries in Minnesota, but two positions in Minnesota that are open to first call pastors. There are 6 positions currently available through the Church Leadership Connection system. And right now, there are 87 people that are looking for positions specifically in Minnesota. Now, what that means is that when candidates for ministry have completed their personal information forms, they have placed their geographical choice on their forms. So what we know is that some people will check, I'm open to going anywhere. And some people will check they're only interested in going to a particular state. And so out of the number that we talked about earlier, there are 87 people who've said we want to go particularly to Minnesota. Does that help answer the question a little bit?
Yes.
Okay, and so you can look at this report on a regular basis. Let me see if I can get online, and I'm going to show you where this report is. So if you can see my screen, you'll see I'm at the home page for the Church Leadership Connection. Over on the left-hand side menu, there are resources for call seekers and for calling organizations. There are forums, and there's a user guide there. The opportunity search is there, and then you'll see this report that I was speaking of, the applicants and positions report. So right now, we're looking at 3:47 p.m., and there's not a lot of changes there. But this is a real-time snapshot, and it continues to change as people put their PIFs in the system and as people have accepted calls and their name is removed from the system, this particular report will change. So if you were to go down and you looked at people who are looking for a particular type of positions, right now, for associate pastor positions, and there's some for Christian education, some for other, some for youth. But if you were to look at associate pastor, there's 1,075 people who have indicated that they are interested in associate pastor positions. If you come down and you look at just a pastor, a designated term pastor, there are 778 people looking for those type of positions. A pastor that's going to be doing new church development or planting a church, 524. Individuals who are interested in being temporary pastors or student supply pastors, that number is 765. But if you go to solo pastor, and I'm skipping some, you go to solo pastor, there's 1,617 people currently looking for solo pastor positions. So that's how this report can be helpful to tell you who's in the system and what positions they're looking for. And then we talked about this already, the geographical choice. That's by state. Any questions about this report?
No.
Okay. So let me go back. So the other thing that I think that you should become familiar with is the Book of Order references for the call process. Now, when we talk about a call process, I want to be very clear that within the PCUSA, there are certain standards that the denomination has in place, but there are other policies that your individual presbytery would establish. So there are going to be certain things that everyone has to abide by, and then there are going to be particular things that our presbytery commissional leadership has established and the presbytery has endorsed. And so we want you to become familiar with those resources, and you can find it under the presbytery's website under resources and forms. So the information around call and installation, pastoral vacancies, election of the pastoral nominating committee, the call process, terms of call, and installation service, you're going to find that in section G2. And again, I will make these slides available to you. The type of pastoral relationships can get somewhat confusing for people, because when you look at the church leadership connection, when you complete your ministry information form, one of the things that you're going to do is select the type of position that you have, and there's this long list of position titles. That's for matching purposes only. But within the Book of Order, under G2.0504, there are only two types of pastoral positions: an installed pastoral position, pastoral relationship. That relationship is established. It's an installed position. It might be a designated pastor or a permanent pastor. Those positions are elected by the congregation, and they may have a designated term, which it may be for 2 years, it may be for 3 years, or it may have an indefinite term. And then you have temporary pastoral relationships. Temporary pastoral relationships are established with the session. Now, keep in mind, the presbytery endorses all of these relationships, but the temporary pastoral relationships can be an interim pastor, a transitional pastor, a supply pastor, a student pastor, a gap pastor. We have various names, but what's important is that temporary pastoral relationships are for a 12-month period. They can be renewed if approved by the session and also by the commission on leadership. Any questions about that?
Nope.
Okay. So secession restrictions. I'm wondering if someone could put their phone on mute. We're getting a little bit of feedback. Secession restrictions is something that the denomination changed back in 2012. Prior to 2012, an associate pastor could never become head of staff of the congregation that they were currently serving. An interim pastor could never become the next installed pastor. Well, in 2012, those guidelines changed. And so now the temporary can become the next installed, but there is a process. There has to be a 3/4 vote of the presbytery that would approve the change in pastoral relationship. And then if you are to make that type of decision, you don't make it just because you don't want to go through a search, but you make it because maybe this person has a particular gifts and you want them to continue leading the congregation longer than just the 12-month or maybe even 24-month temporary time period. It should be an exception and not the norm. But there are times when you want to put in place the secession restrictions, and it works for congregations. Any questions about that?
No.
Okay. So, who we are, and who's God calling us to be, and where is God calling us to go? I bet these questions sound really familiar, because if you did any type of mission study, you are probably working with these particular questions. Who we are, who's God calling us to be, and where is God calling us to go? These are discernment questions. I like to say that they're questions not just for the search committee, but they're questions for the entire church family. I think it's important that as you are working as a search committee, you want to keep in mind some of the things that have been expressed to you from members of the congregation. As you've talked about your future, where you think God is calling you, and what are our needs, and all of those things. And so hopefully you will go back to your congregational surveys, if you use surveys, or that you would go back to your congregation reports from your mission study and to continue to allow that information that was gathered from the congregation to help you in your discernment as a pastor nominating committee. So what makes for a good pastoral match? Cynthia Woolever and Deborah Bruce, who wrote Leadership That Fits Your Church, back in 2012, did a survey of a number of congregations, some Presbyterian and just some other congregations, and really asked the question of what makes for a good pastoral match. So if you ask pastors in congregations, you can imagine that you're going to get two different type of answers. For pastors, when pastors talk about what makes for a good match for them, pastors talk about how the congregation worships, whether there are resources there, whether there are children there, whether there's been high turnover. These are the things, whether there's finances to sustain ministry, whether there are leaders, congregational members who are willing to share in with the ministry of the church. These are the things that pastors talk about when they talk about what makes for a good congregational match. If you were to ask congregational members what makes a good match for them, they will say that pastors and worshipers understand a good match differently. Congregations understand a good match when they have meaningful worship, when there's care for children and youth, when there's empowering leadership, when we are looking to the future. These are the things that make a good match. When there are stable finances, when ministry yields good satisfaction, when there's not a whole lot of anxiety and stress in the congregation, and when there is a commitment of a pastor. So congregations are looking at all of those things in longevity. They don't want someone that's here today and gone tomorrow. Most congregations want to have someone that's going to walk with them for some period of time. So that's what the survey results said. Any questions about that? Any comments?
No.
Okay. Let's keep going. So this is the document on calling a pastor that I was mentioning to you. I really want to encourage you to take advantage of this document. So if you look at On Calling a Pastor, the chapters are outlined here. Is an introduction to calling a pastor. It provides the theological foundations for the call process. One of the things that we constantly have to remind search committees is that when you're calling a pastor, you're not hiring a pastor. We often use that language that we get from secular society when we talk about hiring. A call is very different. And it's not the same process that you would use if you were calling for any particular job. If you were hiring the sexton or the treasurer, you may have some similar things that you would want around integrity and honesty and experience. But calling a pastor is different. It's based in our theology of openness to God's Spirit and who God calls. The one story in Scripture that often sticks in my mind is when David was identified to be the king. And if you remember, his father, Jesse, never thought of David. David was out in the fields, and he was a shepherd boy, and Jesse paraded all of his sons, and the prophet just kept saying, not that one, not that one, not that one. And as it turned out, no one would have thought David. David comes, and he's the one that God had actually chosen. And so, really discerning God, Paul, and really depending on the Spirit to lead that process is a very important thing. How do we hear God? How do we know when we're on the same page? These are important questions for search committees. Part 2 talks about teaching elders as pastors, teaching elder-pastor relationships, leadership options for small churches. It provides some sample covenant agreements. It talks again about succession restrictions and orderly exchange. Orderly exchange is the relationship that we have with our ecumenical partners. We have a relationship with the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, with the United Church of Christ, with the Reformed Church of America, with the Korean Presbyterian Church abroad, and we have a covenant relationship with the Mennonite Church. And so churches that are a part of those denominations, ministers that are part of those denominations can serve in installed roles. But it is a different process. You won't find them using the church leadership connection system. They are identified through adjudicatory to adjudicatory search. So if you have exhausted all of your efforts to identify a Presbyterian teaching elder or a commissioned pastor to serve your congregation, you can make a request, and I can send your job description out to our ecumenical partners and to say, do you have someone that would be a good match for this congregation? We would screen the person's application and then forward those names on to you. Any questions about that process? Okay. Part 3 talks about the call process. It gives you a chart. It tells you the steps. Part 4 talks about transitions, dissolving pastoral relationships, planning for transition, and it really gets into the nuts and bolts of the work of the pastor nominating committee. Part 5 is searching for a pastor, using CLC, writing the MIF, the interview process. If you haven't looked at chapter 5 and it talks about the interview process, it talks about questions that you might have. Part 6 talks about calling the pastor, selecting the nominee, extending a call, concluding the search committee's work. And then you can download videos. So I want to go to one video for you. So if we were to go to this one particular video, let's get back to the Church Leadership Connection. It's kind of timed out. So if you go to the Church Leadership Connection, again, on your left-hand side, you'll see this menu bar. You will see on calling a pastor. When you click on that, you can come down to the various videos. They are very short. If you look, the tutorials run 4 minutes, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 3 minutes. They're not long. That's the point I want to make. So I'm going to choose one. Tell me one that you might have an interest in. The first one is an intro. You can look at that at your own on your own time. Presbyterian polity and call is the other is a call process. Mission studies, call and fit, calling first call pastors. You can look at that at another time. Appropriate questions for interviews, reference checks. Which one would you like to hear?
Questions.
Questions. Appropriate questions. I'm glad you chose that one because I was going to choose it. Okay, let's look at it. And we are really trusting that technology is going to work today. So it's taking a moment to load up. And here we go. Buffering. Well, here we go. Are you able to hear that?
No.
Oh,
Huh. Okay. I apologize. Are you able to hear that?
No.
You're not able to hear it.
Yeah.
Okay.
As far as questions go, we had looked at, I don't remember where it was, but we've looked at predetermined questions from the presbytery already.
Mm-hmm.
No, whoops. Oh, we're
Okay.
getting- no.
So the video is not going to play well enough for you to be able to hear it. I apologize. But the opportunity, again, is for you to go back and to look at those various videos. They're short. They will be important. So the presbytery has provided you some guidelines through its various resources. The COL menu has several recommended questions. The Uncalling a Pastor also resource has questions for you. There may be questions that you want to ask, maybe based upon your mission study and things like that, that are very particular to your congregation. But appropriate questions for interviews is going a little bit further than that. There is a ministerial exception that the federal government has provided to congregations. Religious institutions are able to ask whatever question necessary to determine fit. So what that means is that as you are interviewing candidates, and you may have a particular question about their lifestyle, you may have questions about their family, you may have questions about their sexuality. You are able to ask those questions if it will help you to determine fit. Now, you need to ask the same questions of each candidate. And I would encourage you that you would ask questions that are beneficial for you as you're thinking about your own congregational needs. And so you certainly don't want to ask questions. I remember one time, I'll share this with you, I was interviewing for the first church that I served, and it was the fourth time that I had spoken with the search committee. And during that face-to-face interview, now we were at the face-to-face stage, and I was meeting them in person for the first time. One of the questions that I was asked during that conversation was, do I cry easily? And so I was shocked. Shocked, it was an attorney that was a part of the search committee that asked me that question. And in my mind, I wondered whether or not that same attorney had asked any of the male candidates that question. And I'm pretty sure that he had not. It was my decision on the way that I wanted to answer it. And so I used humor because I really was hoping he was kidding. He wasn't kidding. I did get the call and served very well there. But again, was that an appropriate question? And so there are times when we ask questions, and if we really are honest about it, are they the type of questions that really lead us to understanding whether or not this person is a fit for us? And I think that's what's important as you are forming your questions, whether you have written secondary questions that you want people to respond to, or whether or not you are asking questions in your initial conversation, you want to ask questions that really get you to fit. And we'll talk a little bit more about fit. So I do want to answer that question that I've been asked several times. Are there things that we cannot ask? And that answer to that is you can ask whatever you need to ask, but you need to ask the right questions and make sure that it's based upon determining fit and not that you're trying to just ask any old question like, do you cry easily?
Sandana,
Mm-hmm.
for the follow-up questions, so I understand the premise completely of asking the same questions and having some kind of a template so you're staying on track. But the follow-up questions, sometimes they're just clarifying depending on what the answers are. Does that need to
Right.
be repeated the same way, or is it relevant only to that specific question for that candidate?
No, I think you're correct. If there are follow-up questions for clarification, you certainly don't have to ask those same questions of each person. But sometimes people will have secondary questions as a second screening. And so you will find that they will do initial interviews, but then as they narrow down their candidates, there may be other things that they want to make sure that they can compare apples to apples between candidates, and they may have written questions. And so you would want those questions to be the same, but follow-up questions in general, if there are things that you want to explore more, or maybe something that comes out of a reference check that you want to really have clarity on, certainly you can individualize those questions for your particular candidates.
Thanks.
Does that help, Deb?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Any other questions about that? Okay. So again, theological foundations for the call, and openness to the Spirit, and discernment. These are the keys for your process. We know that there are partners in the call process, the presbytery, the congregation, and the pastor, and everyone has to agree. I don't think we've had it in this presbytery where there ever was a time where a congregation was ready to move forward in calling a person, and the presbytery said, no, this person would not be a good match, not only for your congregation and your for the presbytery, and we cannot authorize this call. I don't know, my relationship with the presbytery is just about 2 years old, and so maybe there's some things in presbytery history when you've had that to happen, but sometimes it can happen. Sometimes a person may seem to be a match for the congregation, but they may not be a match for the presbytery. Or it may be a match for the presbytery and they're not a match for the congregation. So it's all about the three parties coming together and discerning together that this is God's will. And often it goes very smooth. Sometimes there can be steps along the way that require additional conversation. And so we've already talked about this, so I won't talk about the individual videos, but just know that they're there for you. How long does it take? And so that's the question that people have. How long does it take? So this is what we know statistically. A search process can take anywhere from 12 months to 24 months, and that's the average. So it is not a quick process. And what can make that process even longer? Sometimes it's determined by resources. If there are very little resources available for the call, that may make your call take a little bit longer to fill. Maybe you have a less than full-time call. Those calls are always a challenge to fill. Maybe you are in an area where it's very hard for a family to be able to settle into the area. Maybe the area is extremely expensive. When I used to do training for the national church, I had gone up to New York City Presbytery often to do training for their committee on ministry. And they would ask me all the time, Sandana, it's taking a long time. Why is it taking so long to fill a call in this area? And so the first thing that I would say is, tell me about your call package. And I would hear things like, oh, we can call a full-time pastor and we have a call of $75,000 and we would like 5 to 10 years experience. And I would say, it's going to take you a very long time to find a pastor. Because in New York City, $75,000 is like $20,000. It's like that in California. It's like that in many of our big cities. And so one of the things that that congregation needed to do is to really have a reality check around how much would it cost for someone to be able to live in your area and actually be able to thrive and to find adequate housing and all of those other things. And so the effective salary and the benefits that are provided make a huge difference One of the things that we know on average, new pastors coming out of seminary today, many of them are coming out of seminary with more than $75,000 in debt. So if that's true, if we have calls that are effective salaries of even $50,000, that may not work for a candidate. They may not, even though they may want to accept the call, they may not be able to afford to accept the call. And that's another reality. So how long it takes has many factors around it. So if you have a less than full-time call, it's going to take you longer. If you don't have a lot of resources to put toward a call, it's going to take you longer. If you are in a hard-to-call place, it will take you longer. So that's just the reality. Sometimes does it go faster? It certainly can go faster. But often does it go quicker than the average of 12 to 24 months? Not often. Questions about that? Because I know that you have concerns about how long it takes. Any questions?
Yes, I do have a question.
Sure.
Donna. I assume that 12 to 24 months is from the time that the PNC has been selected. Is that correct?
I think it's when they really start their work. And I say it that way because some PNCs meet sporadically, some PNCs meet weekly. It really depends on how you are doing your work and the process that you're using. If you are meeting on a regular basis, you don't have to necessarily meet every week, but if you're meeting monthly, you're getting matches, you're going through those matches, you have a clear process that you want to use, it helps you to certainly move forward.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions about how long it takes? Okay. I really wanted you to look at the call and fit video, but I encourage you to look at that and certainly to do that with your committee. So we're not going to be able to do that. What type of search? We have choices in our search process. So for those who are on the call today, you all are doing a national search. A national search means that you have put your ministry information form into the Church Leadership Connection system, and that you are getting matches from that national database, and that's how you're doing your search. A local search would be, maybe you do not use a ministry information form, but you may just have a job description and you post it maybe on the Presbytery website, on the Senate website. You let people know that you have a position available. Normally the local search is used for more temporary positions, but when you are doing installed permanent position, then the national search is the best way to do that type of search for new pastoral leadership. Any questions? So you all, for those that I know are on the call today, you're doing a national search because you're looking for an installed pastor in a permanent position. So taking into consideration your congregation's place in the life cycle will help you to discern who God might be calling to serve the church. So we're going to talk a little bit about this. So there is considered life cycles of congregations. And as you're listening to this part, I hope that you will start to say, that's where my congregation is, or we may be in between these two of these life cycles. And so this work comes from Alice Mann. The book is entitled, Can Our Church Live? Auburn Institute published this back in 2014. There have been a number of people who have written about the life cycles of congregations. But I like Alice Mann's work. So she talks about birth. As you can imagine, that's a new church plant. She talks about formation. This is a pretty young congregation. Then she talks about stability, and then she talks about decline, and she talks about death. And so let's move forward. So here's the life cycles. Birth is the earliest moments in a congregation's story containing powerful bits of genetic information that would express itself in the rest of the life cycle. Then formation, when the congregation's basic identity is established, Stability is fruitful, sustainable ministry that is the direct result of a congregation's formation cycle. And then decline, the noticeable reduction in the congregation's morale, energy, and attendance, a downward look on previous successful ministry initiatives, declining resources, and congregational depression. And I talk about congregational depression because have you ever seen a depressed person? You ever seen that? Well, you can also see and feel a depressed congregation. When there's no energy, there's no enthusiasm, we're just kind of going through worship. It's just rote, it's ritual without meaning. There's no growth, there's no vision, there's no hopefulness for the future. These are the things that you notice. It's more than a bad winter that keeps people away. It's a good sunny day. It's in the middle of spring and no one shows up for worship. People don't show up for the various special programming. These are signs that something is going on. When you look at the age of the congregation and you see no young people at all. And when I say that, it doesn't mean that you've got to have a church full of young people. Sometimes the demographics in a particular area will indicate that you don't have that many young families. Young families don't mean that you have a growing church. But the question is, if you haven't received any new people for baptism, if people are not joining the church, if people are only leaving by attrition, death, and or people are moving away, what does it say about where your church is? The other thing is death. So a congregation, often death comes very, very slowly. And it's a result of waiting too long to try something new. The environmental conditions change, the loss of leadership. You can't find officers to serve anymore, the loss of vision, the loss of resources. These are the things that are identified within the life cycle. So I won't ask you to talk about them here, but I wonder if you can identify where your church might be. And would you feel comfortable just saying, yes, I can see our church in one of these categories? Anyone? Does any of this sound familiar?
Yeah, we went through this process at our church, and we found we've kind of done all of them
Sure.
over a cycle, and you swing back, you try to do something different. The death piece, thankfully, we haven't reached that level.
Mm-hmm.
But it is a dose of reality when you actually walk through and talk about and have all the different insight from the members of the congregation responding, where there's some that are extremely optimistic and there's others that are realists, and then there's others who are not, they're very pessimistic, and you get a sense of where you're really at. So it can be a good way to get that capture of where people feel you're at. Yes.
And you made a very important point, Deb, is because you can go back and forth. Now, you don't go back to birth. You don't go back to birth, but you can go back to say, who are we today, and how does that line up to who we were when we began ministry? That's a really important question. That question often will help you to decide where you need to go as you're looking at the future.
I actually worked for a
to say something else. Mm-hmm.
That after decades was still at the birth stage. Mm-hmm. Never got past that. There was not that development, of allowing a natural development to happen. There was just holding on too tight, and it was like, this is not healthy.
Sure.
So,
yes, yeah. And one of the things that we do know, even within Minnesota, where people feel like our communities are homogenous, our communities are not homogenous. They are changing. And so as they continue to change, you may have been a congregation that served people who lived right in your community. And so people were able to walk to church. But you may now be a commuter congregation where people are traveling miles to get to your congregation. And so maybe if they are traveling to your congregation, they can no longer participate in all the weekday activities that you have. That can have a significant impact on the way you do ministry. Pastors really should be thinking about that. How do you use electronics? Just think, several years ago, we could not have this conversation online. We would be having this conversation in person. And then it would be dependent on how many people who could come. And we know we're having this conversation during the day, so we're now recording it so that others can listen to it. So there are many things that can contribute to what happens. One of the biggest things that happen with congregations that I think is related to the life cycles is, how do we maintain stability? The resources to do ministry at the level that we want to do them. So for most congregations, some congregations have a nice cushion and they have reserves that are available for ministry. But for other congregations, they are dependent upon the gifts of a few people, that the stewardship has not necessarily been developed in a way that the congregation is totally funded by the majority of the ministry, is not totally funded by the majority of the people. It's funded by a few people who are very large givers. That's true across the board for many of our Presbyterian churches across the nation. And so we have to do things differently, because what happens when those individuals cannot support the church at the same level that they used to support the church? And that becomes a very big challenge to stability. Sustainable ministry. The other thing is that we do know that there are patterns of ministry that are not healthy, where the pastor does everything. So when that pastor leaves, the ministries no longer continue because you haven't done leadership succession training and you don't have someone else to step in that role. So these are the things that you want to think about as you're looking at this. Let's move on. So congregational sizes, I'm going to do this very quickly. You will see that there are categories of congregations. Family-sized church is a church 0 to 50 in worship. These are worshiping numbers. Some people will say, let's keep it to the numbers of people on the roll. I think when we look at our particular rosters, it's very deceiving. You'll see people who have congregations that are the size where they'll say we have 600 people, but in actuality, they only have 150 in worship, sometimes less than that. And then the question is, why do we keep people on the rolls who are no longer active members of the church? So pastoral size is anywhere from 50 to 150. Program size is 150 to 350. Corporate size 350 to 500, and mega 700. Now, mega church, you have to put that in context, because if you're talking about many non-denominational churches, that number could be 7,000, it could be 20,000. But most Presbyterian churches fall between 150 members, and I wouldn't even say 350. I was going to say that program size of 150 to 350, but actually the average Presbyterian church across our nation is about 150 members with 82 members worshiping. That's the average.
Wow.
So that's a reality check for us. Someone wanted to say something. Any comments about those numbers? Okay. You wanted to say something. What were you going to say? Okay, I thought I heard someone. Okay, so how to read the PIFs. So when we talk about that, the first thing that I know people go to are the narrative questions. And so there are 4 questions that we ask people to consider. There are 2 questions that I I like these questions because I wrote these questions for the National Church. So I wrote these questions, but when I wrote the questions, one of the things that I really look for, we restrict the responses to 1,500 characters. And I like to really focus on question 2. And I'll talk a little bit about that because it says, describe the ministry setting in which you believe God is calling you. When we talk about this, that's the passion question. That's the question where you are reading it to hear, does this person have a clear articulation of their own sense of call? And do they also have a sense of the type of people they would like to serve, the type of congregation that they like to serve? It's almost the dream question, but it's not the same as a dream question. It is about a sense of call. And so that's that passion question. And if that question, number 2, doesn't get you excited, the others probably won't get you excited either. Mm-hmm. The other one that I look at, they're all important questions, but I look at number 4. Describe a time when you have led change. I really want to know, here I'm looking for someone to give me concrete examples of a time when they've moved an organization from one place to another place. Can they articulate that well enough? Are there measurable things that are discussed here? The other questions, again, are also important. Describe a moment in your recent ministry that you recognize as one of success and fulfillment. So part of my work also was developing these questions for the National Church for both the Ministry Information Form and for the Personal Information Form. But I would review personal information forms for ministers looking for positions. So I remember one time I was reviewing a personal information form for a person who had been in ministry for 30 years. Okay, hear that number, 30 years. And when I was reading their question 1, their statement related to a time when they were in seminary. What do you think is wrong with that?
It's pretty far in the past.
Pretty far in the past. And that's what I said to them. Are you saying that you haven't done anything of late in your recent ministry that you think is successful or fruitful or good works that you could talk about? And it was a telling response. The other one is number 3, people really struggled with this question. And I would always, when I was training candidates for ministry, people will go, I don't want to answer that question. What areas of growth have you identified in yourself? And so someone said, well, I'll write down that I need to lose weight. And I said, you can certainly do that. or they would say, oh, I would write down that, I need to do this and I need to do that, change things that are not substantial. This question really is a question about what have you done to prepare yourself for the type of position that you're applying for. So if you have been an associate pastor, for an example, and you've never had the responsibility of moderating a session or preaching every Sunday or building relationships with the community, and now you're saying in question 2 that this is what you have a sense of call to, I really want to know what you have done to prepare yourself to move from a very different role into the new role that you're applying for. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah, I actually read the question more from historic as opposed to current, and I was trying to think if there was a way to word that, because I really wasn't thinking about immediate, and sometimes it's helpful to be honest about that, to figure out what it is that you need to do to change, and yeah.
Yeah, and I think that you can answer this question in various ways, but it really should be speaking to, one person has said, I don't want to air my dirty laundry out to everyone. And I'm saying you want to be transparent about what you have done to prepare yourself for the work. And so if it means that you go back to school and you've taken certain classes, if it means that you have become more self-aware and you realize that, you need more to improve your interpersonal relationship skills, for example, or maybe you overfunctioned. Maybe you were a person that was an overfunctioner and if you didn't do it, it wasn't done right. How do you talk about those things so that you are revealing that there is some growth, some work that you've done? So that's something that I pay close attention to. And I ask that you would do that too. So let's move on. So the other part of the matching process on CLC, you were all asked to choose up to 10 leadership competencies. So on the Church Leadership Connection, you have your primary criteria. So that criteria is going to be the experience level, the salary, your geographical choice, the type of position, and language. Those things are your 5 primary criteria. You have to meet that in order for your PIF to be referred. The secondary criteria is going to be the leadership competencies. You choose up to 10, and then the candidate chooses up to 10. Leadership competencies, and I'll give you a good working definition for one in a minute, but when you are looking at your leadership competencies on the Church Leadership Connection form, the MIF and the PIF, they're broken down into 4 categories: theological and spiritual interpreter, communication, organizational leadership, and interpersonal engagement. So when you were choosing the competencies for your ministry information form, hopefully when you chose those competencies, these were things that really came out of your conversation around your mission study as you were putting together your particular needs for a leader and things that you wanted to be important. So hopefully you chose maybe one from each group. I don't know if you did or not, but most likely that you did. They have definitions, and I really invite you, if you haven't done this, spend some time with these definitions, because as candidates are also answering the questions about their leadership competencies, the candidates should be reading over the definitions of what it means to be bivocational. So I'll tell you something, this is just a little humor. Again, I was reviewing a PIF for someone, and they had listed for one of their leadership competencies that they were bilingual. Well, I immediately went back to look at their part 1 or their PIF, and it said the only language they could speak was English. So I said, well, you're saying that you have a competency for being bivocational, but you've only identified one language. These are the little things that can pop up as you're reviewing PIFs that tells you a lot about the candidate. Now, maybe it was a mistake, maybe it wasn't, but again, things to note and pay attention to. When you're talking about competencies, you're talking about measurable wisdom, learned skills, gifts and talents, a holistic leadership blueprint. So again, when you get your PIF referrals, it's going to tell you how well that individual has matched with your MIF. So when I do your matching, if we receive a referral for someone who's matched with you less than 4 out of 5, I don't think that there's a lot of compatibility, at least based upon what you've said. So I won't necessarily send to you the names of people who match with you under 4, but say you have exhausted all of your matches, and now you're at the point where you are down to where you don't have anyone who's matched with you more than 4 out of 5, then I will send you all of those. Or if you say to me, Sandana, It doesn't matter if someone matched with us 1 out of 10, we want to see them, I will send them to you. But we don't want to waste the committee's time on people who are clearly not a match for you. So the system does the first search for us. Any questions about that?
Nope.
Okay. So how do you measure some of these things? So if you had a PIF in your hand and you were looking, I'm looking at under the spiritual interpreter, theological and spiritual interpreter, and one of the definitions is for a lifelong learner. It says an individual who uses every experience in life as a potential tool for growth, one who pursues continuing education, those who build on strengths and seeks assistance to improve weaknesses. So if someone had checked lifelong learner, where would you look to verify that information on their personal information form?
More.
Just think about the PIF.
Okay.
So I'm sorry, you may not have one right in front of you, but let
Yeah.
me just point to the place. Under continuing education. So you have a continuing education field on the PIF. If a person has checked that they're a lifelong learner, one of the things you would look for is to see, well, let's see the type of continuing education that they've been taking every year. It's very simple to go back again. You're going to measure learned skills, gifts and talents, their holistic leadership blueprint. What are they telling you about their service to the church? One of the other ones that often I pick up when I'm reading PIFs, for example, organizational agility. Often you will have individuals coming right out of seminary and they will say that they have organizational agility. So I immediately go to their PIF and I will look at their service to the church. And that is a field where hopefully if candidates know how to complete their PIF, they would list the committees that they've served on. They will list if they've been a part of any community organizations. All of those things should be listed under their PIF. And organizational agility is not just about, I passed the polity exam. It is about, do you know how your organization works, how the church works? Are you active in your presbytery? So one of the questions that we will ask for those who are currently teaching elders, when we do presbytery to presbytery reference checks, we will ask the presbytery whether or not this individual is an active member of the presbytery. Do they serve on any commissions? If they tell us no, then that tells us a whole lot about who that individual is. And we may have some questions about whether or not they'll be a good presbyter. So this is, I'm just giving you some very basic examples of how you can look at the leadership competencies that an individual lists on their PIF and then actually use their PIF form to go back and to verify whether or not they show how they have incorporated that particular skill set in their ministry. Any questions?
I don't have a question, Sandra, but I have not a question to ask, but for the others on the call, not knowing their relationship or connection to the presbytery, is there a way to help the pastor nominating committees truly understand the value that pastors receive from having a healthy relationship with the presbytery and bringing people to the meetings, because that's how we are governed and structured? Does that show up in any place to help them encourage or support or empower the people to be involved? Because I've heard that there's congregations that don't believe there's any reason to support the presbytery. And that makes it very difficult when there should not be a separation.
No. It's a very good question. So when teaching elders as ruling elders take their vows, they vow to be governed by the polity of the church, and they also talk about sharing in the ministry of the church. So the expectation, a part of what we do in the entrance interview, we ask about the involvement in the presbytery. We also, during our orientation, the onboarding of pastors, we give pastors an opportunity to talk about how they would like to be involved, if they want to serve on a particular commission, those type of things. But there are many pastors who are isolated by choice. They are not participating, and that's not healthy for the congregation, and it's certainly not something that we encourage or support. Pastors are expected to come to every presbytery meeting. They are expected to serve in some capacity, and if they are not able to come, that should be the exception. It should not be the norm. Okay, let's move on a little bit. So how to evaluate leadership competencies. So again, I gave you some very basic things to how can you check on what people say they have gifts and skills in, and actually what a person does have gifts and skills in. So now when you are comparing PIF to PIF, how do you evaluate leadership competencies, and how can it inform your work? So one of the things a competency should measure, how a person receives results, and how do they bring out the best in themselves and others. I often say, do they use any French in how they talk about their work? And what I mean by that, is it all I language? I did this. Or do they talk about we language? Do they talk about collaboration and empowerment? Those are things that I would listen for as you're talking with candidates. If they can lead with vision, find out if they really do have a passion for what they say that they have a passion for. Demonstrate how a person acts with integrity. Now, you may not get this on a PIF, but you will get it as you're having conversation with a person. One of the things that does raise a question of integrity is when a person misrepresents themselves. We've had situations where there were pastors that completed their personal information form, and they may indicate that they have more experience in a particular area serving as a pastor when they've never had that experience. Sometimes people will check an experience level that they don't have. They may say that they have more years of experience than they do, but you can always go back to the ordination date and to see exactly when they were ordained. Now, sometimes people have experience, they've served in a non-ordained role, and that may give them some practical ministry experience, but they should say that. That's still valid experience. But in particular, if a pastor indicates that they have 2 to 5 years of experience, then that means that they have 2 to 5 years of experience serving as an installed, ordained pastor. Is that clear? Okay. And then this other question that I think, number 5, is very important. Communicates how a person improves organizational systems. You're not looking for pastors that are going to come and not help you to move your congregation forward. That's not healthy. You're not looking just to be chaplained. And when we say that, what we mean is someone who's just going to show up on Sundays, who's only going to marry, offer the sacraments, and bury. That's not what you want. You need someone that's going to help you to live into who God is calling you to be now. So I'm going to skip that. What is fit? Simply compatibility. It's shared vision and values, complementing a congregation's foundation stories. It's you want to test the spirit to see whether they are from God. Evaluate the factors of background, ambition, wealth, social status, and power. Skills and abilities. Weigh options based upon past and present behaviors related to a particular leadership role. Evaluate these differences between candidates. That's how you determine fit. Any questions? So one of the things that we know is that the search process is not foolproof. Sometimes it doesn't work out the way that you think. Sometimes you may have your heart set on a candidate and you may find that the candidate is in conversation with another congregation and that they are no longer open. And I do want to tell you that it used to be a time when a candidate would begin a search process with one particular church, and they would wait to see whether or not that process would pan out and the way was clear. And then if it did not work out, they would look for another position. Well, that's not the way it is today. Today, you can expect that most candidates are being considered by 2 or 3 other congregations. And they are discerning what is the best call for them. The same way search committees are looking at multiple candidates. So you can never assume that a candidate is not considering other positions. Now, what you can do, if you are really sensing that this particular candidate is the person for your congregation, and you're ready to move forward to calling them for a neutral pulpit, I think it's appropriate to ask the question, are you in conversation with any other congregation? That's an appropriate question. And if they have integrity, they will tell you that, yes, I am. Also, you can expect that candidates will sometimes ask you, after they have interviewed with you, they may ask you to tell them about your time frames. And I think it would be fair to tell candidates that we would like to have a person in place by the end of the summer. We would like to finish up our process. I think those are the types of things that it's only fair that you provide information. Any questions about that? Okay, so gifts and competencies are important. However, what committees ultimately desire to know is, can this person help me and us connect with God? Roy Osteen is the person who said that, and I think that's important. So final questions. What questions do you have that I can answer for you? Now, what I didn't want to do today is to give you the exact same information that your liaison has already given you. But I wanted to have this conversation so that if you had additional questions that we could answer, that we could certainly do that. And maybe it would help to answer some of the questions that you have. So questions and final steps. What questions do you have?
Shondana, I have a question on salary. You know, in the PIFs, they go anywhere from $45,000 to $70,000, $80,000. They say if someone's at 50, are they assuming that that will be their total package, or do they expect housing and other things besides that?
So effective salary is always going to be your cash and housing. If you have a manse, then 30% of the cash salary is your manse allowance. It is expected if you have an installed position, then you would be paying the additional 37% in board of pension dues. Now, that also does not include our presbytery requirements for continuing education. And so you do have to have reimbursables for continuing education, for mileage and those type of things. Social Security offset is not required, but it really is something that you want to consider to make a better call proposal. If you think about it this way, pastors are self-employed, and so if a church does not pay the Social Security offset, then actually the pastor is paying 15.765% of their effective salary in taxes. And that means that's a whole lot less salary for a person to be able to live off of.
Okay, so let's say a $50,000 salary, you're saying would include cash and housing.
And that is the base. That's the base. So if you look at our compensation guidelines, and I don't have it right in front of me, Deb, can you pull that up real quick? I don't want to misquote what our 2019 compensation guidelines. We use a sliding scale. Some presbyteries do not. They'll just say our minimum is this and it's based upon the cost of living in their area. We use a sliding scale based upon your experience level. So I believe for 0 to no experience, for first call pastors, the minimum effective salary is, do you have it, Deb?
I am trying to click on in the.
Let me see if I can get it real quick.
I wish I could tell you I knew the website as well as I would like to.
No problem. Let me see if I can pull it up real quick.
Well,
that's
okay. I mean, that's the question we would come down the road further on, when we start finalizing something.
Well, you do want to make sure that you've had that discussion because, you want to have that discussion early so you'll know. Well, you've already had the discussion because you are talking about your terms of call. You had to put in your ministry information form, your minimum and your maximum. No one sees that, but it's for matching purposes. But you really should have some room for negotiation because our standards for minimum effective salaries is the base. So if you bring someone in and you're expecting them to do transformation work, you're expecting them to help you to do strategy and vision and all of those things, most people with 10 years or more of experience, 5 years or more of experience, they're not going to want to come for minimum salary. So
right.
You really need to have some room for negotiating. The other thing is moving costs. Moving costs used to be the expectation that the congregation paid all of your moving costs. Now you can negotiate that.
I've got the policy open. What are you looking for?
Can you give us the range for the minimum for the years of experience?
So less than 1 year, the total compensation is $53,190. And for more than 9 years, it's $58,509.
What was that, 9?
More than 9 years, $58,509.
Okay.
Do you have a Mance?
No, we do not.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions?
Sandana, this is Barb. We are currently working with CLC, but we were also wondering, is it appropriate to put our name, call a seminary and put our name out there that we're looking for a pastor, or to another presbytery website?
So to answer the first part of your question, I think it's very appropriate to send copies of your ministry information form to seminaries to just make them aware. They love to receive that information because they've got students looking for positions. I would say less appropriate to ask another presbytery to post your ministry information form. Most presbyteries are trying to fill their own positions. So we depend on congregations making their positions known through the church leadership connection system. That's the primary place where people who are looking for positions will go. Even for seminarians, they know that that's there, but it's okay. I would not think it's appropriate to ask another presbytery. Now, what we can do is to ask our Senate, to the Senate of Lakes and Prairies, to create a page, and we've already made this request, that if the Senate of Lakes and Prairies could create a page, they could actually post positions that are open throughout the Senate. We've made that request. They are in the process of changing their website, and I do think that they will move forward in allowing that to happen. But the best strategy is to use the strategy that people use when they're looking to fill positions. So you can post something in the Christian Century. You're going to have to pay for advertisement. Many of our larger churches will do that. You can post something on Presbyterian Outlook. You can certainly do that. As I said, if you exhaust all measures and then you want to look at our denominational partners, we can certainly send your ministry information form out to our denominational partners to say, do you have someone that might be a good match for this position?
So to find the compensation guidelines for Minnesota Valleys, if you go to minnesotavalleys.org, and under the resource tab, click on forms. It's the very first link, the 2019 compensation policy. And that, I didn't give you the level 10. That's on the second page. So that guideline, that minimum is $59,100 for more than 10 years. That would be the end of the scale that is provided here.
Mm-hmm.
And for anybody who doesn't know who I am, my name is Deb Hess, and I'm on COL. I'm new to COL, the Commission on Leadership, and have not been involved with the pastor nominating committee process. So that's why I'm participating in this, is to learn more.
Thank you. Other questions?
I don't think I have any more, so,
Okay.
at this time.
Yeah, that's right. So the two questions that always is before us is, whom do we think we should select to serve, and who is God selecting to serve us? You know, those are the two questions that you really have to wrestle with. And I think as your search committees work, you've got to answer these questions, and you certainly want to, when you're considering candidates and you're looking at credentials and moving forward, you want to make sure that you're very clear and that you have as much of a consensus as possible. I think that's really important, because if you have a divided committee, and it's okay, sometimes there are candidates that have very close credentials and you may like them equally, then I think you're not ready to move forward until you can make a decision. And sometimes that might mean bringing in more than one person for a neutral pulpit. You know, it's appropriate to say that we need to have a couple neutral pulpits. You know, there's a cost factor, but it's worth the cost. It's better to spend the money up front than to spend the money if the relationship goes sour. So it's okay, and it's with time spent. When you're working with PIFs and MIFs, you're working with documents. When you are doing the Zoom interviews or Skype interviews, sometimes those are not the best. You know, sometimes people don't present their best online. Sometimes even in a phone conversation. It depends on the quality of the screen. It depends on the quality of the phone line. Sometimes things are just not the best, but if you have done your reference checks and everything checks out, you might want to move forward if that's, you know, you have a sense of call. But again, you want to have some agreement. You want to narrow down your candidates and be very clear that you're not setting your standards aside. if you have chosen that these are the things that are non-negotiable when we're thinking about a candidate, then you want to stick to those core values around those issues. Now, you need to be open because, again, there's always a David. You know what I mean? There's a David out there sometimes that you never expected. But the other part of it is that if there are particular things that are important, one example that I can think of, you might want to say that it's important that we have a candidate that lives in our community. If that's important for you, then you may not want a candidate that says that I need to commute. If it's important that a candidate and their family are a part of the church. I remember once when we were in Chicago, and I'll end this really quickly, but we were in Chicago, my husband had applied for a position for a Reformed church. And anyway, Reformed Church of America, and they are more on the conservative side. And I had been serving a congregation, Morgan Park Presbyterian Church in Chicago. And he told them, my wife is a pastor. And they were ready to move forward. And then they asked about, well, how often do you think your wife can attend worship? And he said, my wife is a pastor. And she would very rarely be able to attend worship. And that was a deal breaker. And again, so you want to know if a person has a spouse that's not willing to relocate. That's a big issue. You might have a candidate who says, I want to accept a call, and then during the background check, we find out that this person has $100,000 in school loans, and you have a part-time call. We're not going to recommend that call because that person, although they may need a position, can't afford to accept your position, and we know that there's going to be difficulty in the long run. So again, discernment, seeing what God's going to say. So a successful search process might then be described as one that achieves balance, finding a pastor who understands the congregation's values and who will be called on to help congregants confront life's challenges, means finding a pastor with the right mix of both leadership and interpersonal skills. I think that is the answer. Is it a task? It is a working task. Is it doable? It does happen. And so I want to encourage you in your search process not to give up. It's early for many of you. I know you may not feel like it's early, but if you think about that typical time frame between 12 months to 24 months, it's early for many of you, and just give yourself time so that when you do identify the right pastor, you have someone who's going to walk with you for a period of time, and you can see that God is in there, in that call, working with you as a congregation. Thank you for participating today, and if you have additional questions, please feel free to contact me or contact someone from the Commission on Leadership, and we'll be happy to answer your questions as best we can. If there are no other questions, blessings and peace to you in this season of Lent, and our prayers are with you. Have a blessed afternoon. Goodbye.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
I need to get out of here.